Shalom, shalom. Hear, O Israel. This is Romans chapter 5 breakdown. Giving all honor and glory to Yahweh, Ba'ashem Yahushai. Let's get right into it. It's book of Romans chapter 5 and verse 1. And it reads, Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Yahushai HaMashiach, by whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. So Paul in verses 1 and 2, and here he's transitioning from the previous things spoken of in chapter 4, which is how Israel as a whole nation, whether Jew or Gentile, is justified by first and foremost the faith, but not the faith alone, but it's more or less a prerequisite to returning to the former covenants and the law, practices, and the teachings of the prophets, of whom were mainly these Gentiles, these Israelite foreigners, right? So in chapter 4, basically, the things that were addressed were those practicing Jews who had a certain, they had a certain disdain or a dislike to their Gentile counterparts, and were essentially considered them ungodly men in their eyes. This is why in Romans chapter 4 and verse 5, Paul uses such strong language. Let's go to that real quick. Book of Romans chapter 4 and verse 5. But to him that worketh not, but believeth on him that justifieth the ungodly, his faith is counted for righteousness. So this is a strong language that Paul was using, because he's a Jew, but he was also the son of a Pharisee, of these high class, practicing Jews. So he knew that the type of, terminology that they used towards these Israelite foreigners. So again, they were considered, they considered them ungodly men, because they didn't do the practices, they weren't, doing the things that the Jews were doing, as far as, keeping the law, ceremonial practices, and so on and so forth. So, again, this is addressed in chapter 5 also. So the point, Paul is making, is in chapter 4, in the previous chapter, he's showing how these Gentiles, were justified first in their belief and returning to the fold. And using, he used that similitude of Abraham, believing the things, that the Most High had promised him, then showing his belief through the execution of his works, and afterward receiving the covenant of circumcision, which is a commandment. So Paul, he's even, not only letting these Gentiles know these things in this epistle, he's also kind of, speaking to the Jews in the same type of comparison that he's making. He's speaking to the Jews and telling them, look, you have to look further back, to see, how even your forefather, which is Abraham, he was justified in that faith alone, and then showed it through his works. So this is what he was trying to get these Jews to see about these Israelite foreigners, to see that they were believing in Yahushua, they had that faith, and, slowly bringing them back into the fold. So, that circumcision, again, it was commanded, and is a commandment now throughout all generations. So, Paul's telling them to go, hey, you got to go back further back than that, than to where the time of when the law was given. So this is what Paul was doing. So, again, it was commanded throughout all generations. So in comparison as to how a Jew at that time first believed truly, he believed that he could execute the laws, he could keep the laws that the Most High commanded, which was commanded to the generation of Israelites when the law was given to the first mediator, which was Moses. The mediator appointed after that being Yahweh Shai. So Paul, in this chapter, he's trying to get these Jews to understand that, these Gentiles are justified in coming back in this thing. Same way as the Jews at that time, they believed, in the works of the law, first through belief in what was given to them, through the covenants, through the giving of the law, through their forefathers. And what the Most High, commanded out of the precepts of the law. Then, these Jews would formally learn the laws and customs and the things written in the prophets. Then, showing, their faith and their belief through executing those things that the Most High commanded in the law, which is through the righteous works, that are justified in the eyes of the Most High. Most High Yahweh. So, although at the time, there were Jews, who were so, carnal that some of them who, at the time they knew they knew they were Gentiles, that who believed in Yahweh Shai, and in the redemption, for those who have went astray, which is the lost sheep. In the 100 years plus following, the time of Antiochus, the fourth, following the ways, customs of the Greeks and the Romans. So the point being that Paul, he knew and wrote about some of these Jews who were not properly, they weren't properly informing these Gentiles, on how to be properly reintroduced and re-educated into their former customs. The former customs and practices, and knowledge of how all these things, were prophesied to come to pass. For example, let's go to the book of Jeremiah. Book of Jeremiah, chapter 26 and verse 13. So this is just using an example of the things that Paul tried to get these Jews to understand about these Gentiles. This is an example of the Most High continuously, through the prophets, through the law. Moses was a prophet, commanding them to return over and over and over. But you had these Jews, they forsake their Gentile counterparts. There's book of Jeremiah, chapter 26, verse 13. And it reads, "Therefore now amend your ways and your doings, and obey the voice of the Lord your God, and the Lord will repent him of the evil that he hath pronounced against you." So, the point here being is that the prophets, they were the voice of the Most High. commanding Israel to repent, return to their former ways, and constantly, commanding them to return. Another example being, which I went over in the previous videos, Book of Deuteronomy 31 and 29, and also the Deuteronomy chapter 4 and 27. Because according to the precepts, Moses commanded the Israelites out of the law, even commanding those, under the law to return after they have been scattered, and the remembrance to be seized in due time, which is the reason why Paul, constantly quotes these type of precepts. He's constantly, as you notice in his epistles, constantly quoting out of the prophets. Constantly, he quotes out of the law. Because this is the same way Yahushua taught. He taught out of the law. He taught of the law. He taught out of the prophets. A good example being, let me see if I can find that precept real quick. So I have to bear with me. Let's see. I believe it's Book of Acts. Chapter, so like it. I think it's 39. I believe it's chapter 3. It's the Book of Acts, chapter 3, verse 26. Let's see. Well, actually, I'll start at and the apostles, they taught the same thing too. It says in the Book of Acts, chapter let's see, Acts chapter 3 and verse 22. For Moses truly said unto the fathers, a prophet shall the Lord your God raise up unto you of your brethren, like unto me. Him shall ye hear in all things, whatsoever he shall say unto you. Verse 23. And it shall come to pass that every soul which will not hear the prophet shall be destroyed from among the people. So this is the point, being that, they taught out the law, and, this is why, what Paul was trying to get these Jews, to see about this, Israelite foreigners, that they were justified in returning, and also Paul was, getting them to see, that look, this is the man that Moses, the person that you reverence so much, you follow even the laws, but yet there were some Jews who denied, Yahushua. So again, he quoted these type of things, so he can get them rooted in this type of knowledge. This is what these Gentiles, they were deprived of, this type of knowledge, even today, because we constantly have, John 3:16, ingrained in our minds, but we seem to not acknowledge, everything else written in this book. And the Most High, He'll judge you for that too, today. So, again, some of these Jews, they heard, Salakia. Yeah, I think it's froze up. Salakia had some technical difficulties. So these Jews, they heard of these Gentiles returning back to the fold, but instead, them giving them the proper instruction on how to return and to be learned of how all these things came into play. Instead, some of these Jews, like I brought out in the previous video in Galatians 6:13, these men, themselves weren't even grounded in the precepts of the law. They just merely, approached these Gentiles, to get them to circumcise their foreskin, thinking that will justify them, out of carnal works and not, the spiritual things that the precepts taught. Instead, they were, pressuring these Gentiles to, circumcise themselves so they can, glory in the mutilation of their flesh. So this is what, these men were doing back then. And, they didn't even keep the law, or the important matters of the law, like pity, reproof. Instead, they relied on, these sacrificial laws, purification. They really believe that was their ultimate justification. Things like circumcision, offering burnt offerings, and following the law letter by letter. But, but denying the wisdom, that the law and the prophets taught. And the simple things like, Israel returning to the Most High. So this is what these Israelite foreigners needed more than just to follow the law to a T. This is why, it may sound like Paul is kind of going backwards or backpedaling when he teaches about the law. But the main point was him, mainly what he was doing, Salaki, he was, easing these Gentiles back into the fold little by little. And teaching them, kind of sparking their thinking, getting them to kind of think, oh, okay, so, this is where this prophecy came from. This is how Yahushua came into play. Because because it even says in the law and the prophets, Israel would go off, they would leave their covenants, but they were commanded to return in their due time. So let me move on to the next precept. Book of Ephesians, chapter 3 and verse 19. And it reads, and to know the love of Hamashiach, which passeth knowledge, that you might be filled with all the fullness of God. So the point being, Paul knew these Jews weren't giving the Gentiles the things that they needed to be properly informed of their former covenants, and but they believed in Yahushua, and salvation for all Israel, which is why Paul called him, as being part of that ministry. He called himself as being part of that ministry of reconciliation, like it says in 2 Corinthians. Let's go to that precept real quick. It's book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 5 and verse 18. And it reads, and all things are of God, who hath reconciled us to himself by Yahushua HaMashiach, and hath given to us the ministry of reconciliation. To wit, that God was in Hamashiach reconciling the world unto himself, not imputing their trespasses unto them, going off, leaving the covenants, and so on and so forth. And hath commanded unto us the word of reconciliation. Because Yahushua himself, he taught of pursuant to Matthew 15:24, he wasn't sent but to the lost sheep of the house of Israel, and sent to these Jews, to confirm the promises to them, and to bring the fold together. These two types of people, the Jews and the Gentiles, which is why he said, I have a sheep not of this fold also. And that was him speaking about the Gentiles. So the point being, that Paul knew these Jews weren't giving the Gentiles, the Israelite foreigners, the things they needed to be properly informed, of the former covenants. But they believe in Yahushua and salvation. So Paul called him as being, that was his calling, when Yahushua appeared unto him. So, and throughout his epistles, that was the work that he was doing. He's reconciling these two types of mindsets, these two modes of thinking, of the practicing Jews and these Israelite foreigners coming back into the fold. So let me move on to the next precept, this book of Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 14. And it reads, For he is our peace, who hath made both one, and hath broken down the middle wall of partition between us. So Yahushua was sent for that, same purpose, reconcile the two people, Jews and Gentiles. And Paul taught out of those things through what Yahushua, through the things that he said in his ministry, in the gospel, for that time, and the time to come. Now, not as Jews or Gentiles, because we know as far as the terminology, Jew is more so a reference to one tribe of the whole nation. But now, as those who were deceived, and lied to, now we're being showed that true understanding, and how the Most High, is called, those out of this world, whom he had predestined, and into their respective tribes. That is through belief, because we don't know, exactly what tribe we're from, but, the spirit that we're given, we know to where we're called into. But again, to get the proper understanding, we have to understand, these things, and separate the things that were written for that time and the things that were written for us to understand and apply today. For example, you can't, at this present time, call yourself a Jew, because we know that pertains to one tribe of the whole nation. Whereas, technically speaking, if you believe, and you're in this truth, and you believe you're from the tribe of Judah, of course, you would be a Jew. But that's more or less a terminology that's used, in modern times, and it's not, more so something that would be used today, because we're the Israelites, we have to. That's the God-given, nationality that Most High, he gave to his people. Not Jewish, not, Judaism, These things are, man-made terms. So, or for example, calling yourself a Gentile in this time and age, because again, that's just a term, that was given to one of a, it wasn't given to, to just anybody. These were given mainly to Israelite foreigners. You couldn't give give yourself this term, but it was a term given to you. Calling you a Israelite foreigner, Gentile foreigner of a nation. So this terminology was used back then. But we know now, past the ignorance and lies, we know who we are. So we're no longer, foreign to such concepts, as a Gentile or stranger, whatever you may want to call it. So again, this is that middle wall partition that Yahweh Shai came to fulfill and to prophesy of, and in its due time for it to come to pass, and unite the whole nation. This is verse 15. Having abolished in his flesh the enmity, even the law of commandments contained in ordinances, for to make in himself of twain one new man, so making peace. This separation, that Yahweh Shai came to reconcile was this separation that these Jews and Gentiles had, who, not just by ways of thinking or ways of living, but by customs, and this verse, is speaking on how Yahweh Shai was ordained, from the beginning through the first mediator, which is Moses, and also, the law being, the first similitude of forgiveness of sins. Yahweh Shai being that the latter, for the latter times, that mediator, and that, sacrifice, he was that living sacrifice for forgiveness of sins. And all this was prophesied of at the time of the giving of the law to Israel. So again, let's read on a little bit further. And that he might reconcile both unto God in one body by the cross, having slain the enmity thereby. Because throughout his ministry, he was that person to to bring these two nations together. Verse 17, and came and preached peace to you which were afar off, and to them that were nigh. Because we know through Yahweh Shai's ministry, he had the apostles, the disciples. He sent them out, to preach the word. To the Great Commission. That was essentially the Great Commission. Verse 17, Salakia, verse 18. For through him we both have an access by one Spirit unto the Father. Verse 19, now therefore you are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints and of the household of God, and are built upon the foundation of the apostles and prophets, Yahweh Shai HaMashiach himself being the chief cornerstone. So again, like I was saying earlier, and this is Paul, he's showing you over and over that, Yahushua is that foundation, but it's built on the things that were written of in the prophets and the things taught of the apostles, because Yahushua, he taught the apostles and disciples, the things which they were to proclaim and teach. So again, it didn't stop with Paul. He had to teach what was commanded, to these Jews and Gentiles, because it wasn't as simple as, okay, well, you believe and you're saved. That's not how it worked, because if that's how it worked, then all these things wouldn't be written, and, Yahushua wouldn't have to have the apostles, teach this and for the word to get out. So again, these things were necessary to know and to learn. So, we know pursuant to Deuteronomy chapter 18, Yahushua was that living sacrifice for the sins of the whole nation. And also, he came to reconcile the two groups. And that's why it says, making peace, making peace between these two groups to make it prosper. And unite these two parties, Jews who believed and waited for the coming Messiah, and the Gentiles who have been called out of the customs of the Greeks and the Romans. And they believed in Yahushua, through faith, that they had been sanctified and called back to the former covenant. And, when it says laying the enmity, that these two groups had toward another, because they had a differences in law and practices, the Gentiles having, faith in salvation, forgiveness of sins, and the Jews, they through their teachings and beliefs of the law. So they, verse 20 speaks on, further proving the need for these both parties to unite, in the faith in which, these Gentiles were called into. So the Jews, they may also have that same faith that was given, to the Gentiles in Yahushua. And that they may also believe, in forgiveness of sins and redemption through Yahushua Mashiach, as it was written of in the law and the prophets. And the Gentiles, so that they have that same mind, that and knowledge, that these Jews had, and that they brought to the table, which is why Paul, in verse 3, chapter 2, Salakia, chapter 3, verse 2, this is why Paul said that this is the benefit of being a Jew, of these Jews, essentially. And he was saying this to these Israelite foreigners. So let's go to that precept real quick. Book of Romans, chapter 3 and verse 1. What advantage then hath the Jew? Or what profit is there of circumcision? Much every way chiefly, because unto them were committed the oracles of God. So that's the point, being that, in Paul's ministry, him uniting these two groups. Because, Gentiles, they had that strong faith. The Jews, they had that, that, the oracles, the practices, and the origins of these things. So this is what the Jews brought to the table. This is why, Paul preached that word of reconciliation, because these things, and ultimately, through Yahushua, this was the ultimate goal of uniting these two bodies. And that's what it's talking about, in the book of Ephesians. So, again, this is, let me get to that precept in Isaiah, just to show that, this was for the whole nation. Let's see. This is book of Isaiah, chapter 53 and verse 8. He was taken from prison and from judgment. And who shall declare his generation? For he was cut off out of the land of the living. For the transgression of my people was he stricken. So that's talking about the whole nation of Israel. So these is the purpose of Yahushua coming into play, and to for him to unite ultimately, not just the whole nation, but at this time, these Jews and Gentiles. So that's what it was talking about, in this precept. So this is essentially, chapter 4, Paul was speaking about this, and this is why, at times, it may seem that Paul may be saying, two different things in his epistles. This is why his epistles can be confusing. Because, again, Paul was talking to two different groups. So, let's go back to book of Romans, chapter 5. We'll continue at, I think we're on verse 3. Actually, I'll start at verse 1 again. Book of Romans, chapter 1 and chapter 5 and verse 1. Therefore, being justified by faith, we have peace with God through our Lord Yahushua HaMashiach, by whom also we have access by faith into this grace wherein we stand, and rejoice in hope of the glory of God. And not only so, but we glory in tribulations also, knowing that tribulation worketh patience, and patience experience, and experience hope. And hope maketh not ashamed, because the love of God is shed abroad in our hearts by the Holy Ghost, which is given unto us. Actually, let me read verse 6. Verse 6, for when we were yet without strength, in due time, Christ died for the ungodly. So verses 1 through 5, this is Paul, saying that, like he mentioned in the previous chapter, he's establishing the fact that, these two groups are justified through that faith first. And these both Jews and Gentiles believed, they had that hope and the glory to come. Because these Gentiles, they witnessed the things that happened, the miracles, the teachings, and they were, they were enlightened by these things that Yahushua taught, and these Jews, they believe these things, through their practices, so, this is what Paul was speaking of, through, these tribulations, that, you know, these Jews had under these Romans and Greeks, and also the Gentiles, you know, because, you know, those were very turbulent times, you know. So, verse 6, you know, this verse, Paul, he's speaking to the Jews, essentially, and, you know, expounding to them that how in the time appointed, you know, the time of the Greeks and the Romans, you know, that Yahweh would call back, you know, these Gentiles, you know, aka, you know, the lost sheep, pursuant to, you know, what he said in John 10:16, you know, saying he has those of another fold, you know, and also Yahweh, you know, bearing the whole iniquities of the people, the whole nation, like I read in the book of Isaiah, chapter 53. You know, so this is, again, you know, in verse 6, you know, why he uses such strong wording when he says, you know, ungodly, you know, because these Israelite foreigners, they were getting tossed to and fro, you know, different customs. They were around all kinds of idols, you know, and these Jews, they were going through also, you know, tribulation. You know, they had the Romans, you know, slaughtering them as they were bringing, you know, sacrifice to the temple, and so on and so forth, you know. Actually, I didn't bring that precept out. I believe it's in the book of Luke. You know, it's you know, this was a very dangerous time to live in. So this is why Paul spoke of tribulation and things of that sort. So like, yeah, just bear with me. See if I can find this precept. I believe it's in the latter part of Luke. It's book of Luke, chapter 13 and verse 1. And it reads, there were present at that season some that told him of the Galileans, whose blood Pilate had mingled with their sacrifices. You know, so, you know, there was, you know, Jews, you know, that not just these Gentiles, you know, who were going through things, you know, but also the Jews, you know, they would go to offer sacrifices at the temple, you know, and Pontius Pilate, you know, he would, you know, send some guards down, you know, slay, you know, a couple hundred Jews or whatever the case may be, you know. So these were dangerous times to live in, because you got to remember, you know, there was a lot of resistance to the Romans from the Jews. You know, and there's a lot of violence, you know, during the time of Yahushua's ministry, you know, which was around, you know, 33 AD, you know, we knew, you know, we knew that he prophesied of the destruction coming, you know, which was to come in 70 AD. So, you know, but again, going back to Romans 5 and 6, you know, Salakia kind of got off topic right there, but you know, so the term ungodly, you know, is a term, again, you know, Paul was using to reference these Gentiles, and you know, so when these Jews read the epistles, you know, they would know that who were these people that he was talking about, because you can't say, you know, only Gentiles got a hold of the epistles, or that there were only Gentiles in the churches. Because Paul was a Jew. Paul was part of, these churches too. So it's not far-fetched that there were other Jews reading these epistles. So, this was that mindset that these Jews had towards their counterparts, because they had followed these ungodly customs of the Greeks and the Romans. So they themselves were considered, ungodly. Like it was also referenced in Romans 4 and 5. And Paul, he used that example, so like he used that wording as an example of how the Jews felt towards these Gentiles. So you can watch the previous video, to get it more insight on that. But, the reason in being behind Paul using such a bold term was to refer to these Israelite foreigners as ungodly men, to kind of personify the point that he was trying to make. But again, Paul is proving here that these same people were called, ungodly by their own brethren. He was showing that they were also called back into the fold. So now let's continue in verse 7. It's book of Romans chapter 5 and verse 7. For scarcely for a righteous man one will die. Yet peradventure for a good man some will even dare to die. But God commended his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Now, Paul, he's bringing these two, groups into his into this precept, to make the point that, Most High came to call the whole nation back, whether you're a Jew or Gentile. Because again, you quoted Isaiah, you quoted the prophets, things of that sort. Verse 9, much more then, being now justified by his blood, we shall be saved from wrath through him. For if when we were enemies, we were reconciled to God by the death of his Son, much more being reconciled, we shall be saved by his life. Because these two groups, Jews and Gentiles, they were kind of sort of enemies of themselves, but they were the same people, and, when it's talking about being reconciled by the death, and even reconciled, being saved by his life, he's talking about, Yahushua, dying for the nation as a whole. And also, Paul is showing these Jews and Gentiles, that Yahushua came to do a worthy work, when he walked the earth and lived up to his calling, as the Messiah. Because through his death, the sins of Israel were purged, through him and his life. That is his ministry. He came to reconcile these two groups back then and for the time to come. Showing, to the Gentiles, him, coming and showing them what is the true way and light, of righteousness, and how it is manifest through the hearts of men. And to the Jews, he came to show them the true ways, of executing the law, and what is justifiable in the eyes of the Most High. So, Paul is speaking, of the worthy works that Yahushua did, in his life and his death. Verse 11. And not only so, but we also joy and God through our Lord Yahushua Mashiach, by whom we have now received the atonement. So here he's speaking of the atonement for sins for the whole nation. Verse 12. Wherefore, as by one man's sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. So you can't take this precept and make a whole doctrine out of it. You have to get the proper understanding. And you have to go, like Paul was trying to get these Jews and Gentiles, he had to get them to go way back. So this verse, Paul is going into another similitude, this time comparing the death to all men through Adam's transgression. And Yahushua, and him redeeming those who were in transgression through Adam. And then those ordained through the law and redeeming them from those transgressions. These were two comparisons that he was making. From the transgressions that were, ordained under the law. Showing the grace that the Most High had towards his chosen seed and throughout all those generations of the patriarchs. Because through Adam, there did come death, knowledge of good and evil, because he ate of that fruit. Which the fruit being a similitude, of him, acquiring, this knowledge of good and evil, and how in his seed, it was manifest the same works. For example, Abel and Cain. They had knowledge to offer sacrifices. This is the knowledge of things that is good knowledge, or things that are acceptable to the Most High. And the knowledge of evil works, which the Most High put in the spirit of Cain. That to deceive, kill your own people, to hate your brother, which is the works that these are works of evil. So to get a backdrop, and to get a foundation on what Paul is trying to establish, let's look at the account in Genesis for better understanding. Let's go to book of Genesis chapter 2 and verse 9. And it reads, "And out of the ground made the Lord God to grow every tree that is pleasant to the sight, and good for food, the tree of life also in the midst of the garden, and the tree of knowledge of good and evil." So, the main focus here are the two trees, the tree of life and the tree of good and evil, of knowledge of good and evil. Now, the tree of knowledge of good and evil, God commanded Adam not to eat of it. It's book of Genesis, chapter 2 and verse 16. "And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, Of every tree of the garden thou mayest freely eat, but of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil thou shalt not eat of it. For in the day that thou eatest thereof, thou shalt surely die." So the Most High, he said the day that you eat it, you will surely die, and, that Adam, Adam eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, him and Eve, they became aware that, they were naked, which is being naked, being a representation of being in sin. Or in transgression. because sin is a transgression. So let's get to that precept. This book of Exodus, chapter 21, Salakia 32, verse 21. And it reads, And Moses said unto Aaron, What did this people unto thee, that thou hast brought so great a sin upon them? Verse 25. And when Moses saw that the people were naked, for Aaron had made them naked unto their shame, amongst their enemies. So that being a representation of being in sin or in transgression. So the Most High gave them that commandment, which was a commandment. This is what Paul's trying to get these Jews and Gentiles to understand in the similitude, because again, they were in sin because of that sit. They were Salaki. They were naked because of that transgression. How? Well, they didn't keep the commandment that the Most High gave them, not to eat of that knowledge, good and evil. But the woman seeing, that the knowledge was desirable and could make, one wise, she was enticed by it. Same way, we're enticed by these philosophies in modern days of time. So it's book of Genesis chapter 3 and verse 6. And it reads, And when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was pleasant to the eyes, and a tree to be desired to make one wise, she took of the fruit thereof, and did eat, and gave also unto her husband with her, and he did eat. And the eyes of them both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. And they sewed fig leaves together, and made themselves aprons, so they knew they were in transgression. Same way Paul is making a similitude of, the law being, comparing that to the law being the knowledge of what's good and what's evil. What to keep, what to desire to keep, what is justifiable in the eyes of the Most High, and what is considered transgression. For example, laying with your close of kin. So this book of actually, let me read verse 22. Book of Genesis chapter 3 and verse 22. And the Lord God said, Behold, a man is become as one of us, to know good and evil. And now lest he put forth his hand, and take also of the tree of life, and eat and live forever. So the point here being that, Paul uses a similitude of Adam's transgression. Same way he used the similitude of Abraham, him having faith, and then showing it through the execution of his works. And him, then after, showing his faith through his works, giving that commandment of circumcision, which all goes hand in hand. Same way as keeping the commandments. You have faith that you want to keep the commandments the correct way, what's according to what's justifiable in the eyes of the Most High. And then manifesting it through your works. Which is why Yahweh Shai taught that, the works of men come from their heart, which your heart being your mind. So Paul uses similitude of Adam's transgression by this one transgression, transgression entering into the world, or, sin, Salakia, through his transgression, transgression entered into the world, which is why Paul said, which we'll go over in a minute, sin entered into the world through him. which is another wording for transgression. And death by transgression, or sin. Um, Sin in this verse, Romans 5:12, being a transgression of the commandment which God gave Adam not to eat of that tree. So through him, the similitude, death by transgression was passed down through all generations. Because, Adam, after having eaten of that tree of knowledge of good and evil, you know, that's a similitude of, knowing what is acceptable and what is unacceptable in God's eyes. Same way as the law tells you, like I mentioned just earlier, what is justifiable in God's eyes and what he accepts. And it also tells you, so that's the knowledge of good, what is good to do as far as works and as far as what is commanded in the law. And also the law tells you what to abhor, what is evil in the eyes of the Most High and what to avoid. So let's go to Romans chapter 5, verse 12. So, wherefore, as by one man sin entered into the world, and death by sin, and so death passed upon all men, for that all have sinned. So we could, read it as, wherefore as by one man, transgression entered into the world, and death by transgression. This is Paul, comparing, the similitude of Adam and that's that transgression that he made, comparing it to the law and the transgression that the law commands, which is death. And so death, being passed upon all men, because all men have transgressed. So we know that, by that one man Adam, and his transgression, transgression entered into the world, which is good and evil works, and death, by that transgression, and death being passed upon all men, and that transgression being works of good and evil, because, again, a good example is Cain and Abel, because they had good and evil works, and it was passed through all men, But before I get into that precept, this is why, Paul said in Romans 4:15, because the law worketh abhorrence. Because if you go into the Greek for wrath, Paul is saying the law tells you what to abhor. For where there no law is, there is no deviation. And transgression in the Greek, that's going into, deviation. What the law tells you, where you're going off, what is unacceptable. For example, things like universal law, like child sacrifice, or or homosexuality. That's a universal law. Most High abhors that. This is why he, for example, he destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So, the law is, tells you what to abhor, and where there is no law, there is no deviation, because the law tells you where there is deviation. So let's go to the book of Genesis, chapter 4 and verse 4. And Abel he also brought of the firstlings of his flock, and of the fat thereof. And the Lord has respect unto Abel and to his offering. So this is a similitude of the transgression that Adam did, entering into the generations through the knowledge that he had, of good and evil. And Abel, being the similitude of the righteous seed, he knew what was acceptable in the eyes of the Most High. But Cain, Most High didn't have respect to his offering because he wasn't given that spirit. He had that wicked spirit on him. This is how that knowledge of similitude of knowledge of good and evil that Paul was using. It says verse 5, but unto Cain and to his offering he had not respect, and Cain was very wroth, and his countenance fell. And the Lord said unto Cain, why art thou wroth, and why is thy countenance fallen? If thou do well, shalt thou not be accepted. And if thou does not well, sin lieth at the door, and unto thee shall be his desire, and thou shalt rule over him. So this is why Paul uses that similitude of through Adam and his transgression, transgression entering into the world. So after this time, Adam and throughout the generations were given to their own imaginations and devices, like I read in Genesis chapter 4. So there's a reason why after this account, Cain and Abel knew what offerings were acceptable to the Most High. Or Cain knew what was wicked, and Abel, he knew what was justifiable. Why? Because he was given that spirit. So go to this precept real quick. Book of Genesis, chapter 6 and verse 5. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. So at this time, men became more and more wicked, and they gave themselves to do evil instead of doing what was acceptable in the eyes of the Most High. So this is what Paul, in his example, what he's trying to show. That through Adam, these good and evil works, were manifest in the generations after him. Through the chosen seed, and also, through those of the wicked seed. The book of Genesis, chapter 7 and verse 1. And the Lord said unto Noah, come thou and all thy house into the ark, for thee I have seen righteous before me in this generation. Noah did what was justifiable, what was righteous in the eyes of the Most High. So from the time, of Adam to Moses, there remained, good and evil men who had given themselves to the desires, of their hearts, of their minds, to the devices, that they gave themselves into. Even today, there's Israelites that are wicked, and they were given that lot because predestination, but also, they gave themselves to those devices. So there's a similitude that Paul is using, because all this came through the transgression of Adam. From Adam, Cain, and Abel, and the generations following that. And after the flood, it was manifest, and and the seeds that were given that same wicked spirit. For example, Canaan. Another example being Esau, which he was he had the spirit of Cain. He had that same wicked spirit. And so this is the comparison Paul was doing. And all this came from the original account, from Adam and him, receiving him of that knowledge. So through those generations, good and evil works remained on the earth, even post deluge, which is the post flood. The generations, these works remained on the earth through the works of men. So, when the law was given, the only thing the law outlined, to the Israelites is what to do and what not to do, which is what Paul was explaining in Romans 4 and 15. So now let's move on to Book of Romans chapter 5 and 13. Book of Romans chapter 5 and verse 13. And it reads, "For unto the law sin was in the world, but sin is not imputed where there is no law." So now Paul, he's not authoritative when it comes to the law. So you can't take these verses and make a whole doctrine out of it, saying, if it doesn't say it in the law, then you're not in sin. Well, the law, tells you, to respect your mother and your father. But does that mean you only respect your mother and your father? No, you have to respect, your elders. You have to respect, your aunt, your uncle, your close of kin, So that's not what that means, this verse. So, you can't take a whole doctrine out of these things, because, again, Paul only expounds on the law. He's not authoritative to what's in the law. So this verse, what it's saying, that at the time of the giving of the law, transgression was already in the earth, which was the good and evil works of men through the knowledge of what came through the similitude of what Adam had, knowing good and evil. This is the comparison Paul is using. This is why when the law was instituted, there was also laws, like I mentioned earlier, that there were what we call them universal laws. Things like child sacrifice, homosexuality. So this verse is saying that these universal laws always applied to everybody. For example, Sodom and Gomorrah and the Canaanites and their land given to the Israelites as an inheritance, for the works that they did. Let's go to that account. is the book of Leviticus, chapter 18, verse 21. And it reads, "And thou shalt not let any of thy seed pass through the fire to Molech, neither shalt thou profane the name of thy God. I am the Lord." Verse 22, "Thou shalt not lie with mankind as with womankind. It is an abomination." So again, these are universal laws, things that the Most High dislikes and abhors. Let's see. Can read verse 24 just to get to the point. "Defile not you yourselves in any of these things, for in all these the nations are defiled, which I cast out before you. And the land is defiled, therefore I do visit the iniquity thereof upon it, and the land itself vomiteth out her inhabitants." So those are is an example of one of the universal laws. Most High casting out these Canaanites that were in the land previously, and giving them as an inheritance, for their, evil works. This book of Genesis, chapter 18 and verse 20. "And the Lord said, because the cry of Sodom and Gomorrah is great, and because their sin is very grievous." So to get the understanding, let's go to on what that sin was. Let's go to chapter 19, verse 4 through 8. "But before they lay down, the men of the city, even the men of Sodom, compassed the house round, both old and young, all the people from every quarter. And they called unto Lot, and said unto him, Where are the men which came into thee this night? Bring them out unto us, that we may know them. And Lot went out at the door unto them, and shut the door after him. And said, I pray you, brethren, do not so wickedly. Behold, now I have 2 daughters, which have not known man. Let me, I pray you, bring them unto you, and do ye to them as it is good in your eyes. Only unto these men do nothing. For therefore came they under the shadow of my roof." So these men wanted to come out and do stuff to these angels that appeared to Lot. But instead, Lot, he said, "Look, I have, my 2 daughters. Let me bring them to you, and do what you need to do to them that you were going to do to these men." Because they were intended on doing, um, homosexual acts. So the point being, because even before the law was instituted, these things were considered evil works, or a similitude of knowledge of evil, or what's unacceptable in the eyes of the Most High. Hence the term, until the law, sin was in the world. Because until the law, at the time when the law was instituted, these works, there was already these types of works in the world. These things had already occurred. But sin is not imputed when there is no law. Let me just go back to Romans. An example of that, well, we can use one of the examples was Abraham, having a stepsister for a wife, because Sarah was his stepsister. This book of Genesis, chapter 20 and verse 12. And it reads, "And yet indeed she is my sister. She is the daughter of my father, but not the daughter of my mother. And she became my wife." You know, so that was his stepsister, but again, that's what it's saying here. The point being that Paul is outlining that some of these things, these acts, um, these type of evil works were already in the world. Things like animals, child sacrifice, and homosexuality. But sin, transgression is not imputed where there is no law. One of the things that applied to this is Abraham having a stepsister wife, because again, when the time when the law was instituted to the Israelites by Moses, then it was made. Then there was a decree not to go to your near of kin, because Jacob, I believe, he married his cousin, but you can, according to the law, you can marry your cousin, but something as close as your stepsister, it outlines in the law you're not supposed to. That's uncovering, the nakedness of your sister, because that's your that's your father's child. And so another example, of sin not imputed where there is no law. And Paul is speaking of from the time when the law was instituted, the time of Moses, and before that. This doesn't apply to today. Nor can you say, well, if it doesn't say this in the law in modern day today, it's not a sin. Things like, celebrating Christmas and things of that sort. Because it doesn't say don't celebrate Christmas in the law, but, it says, to abhor idols, not to have idols, not to make drink offerings to other gods. And everyone knows what Christmas is about. That's an evil, that's a wicked thing. So, again, this is why Paul expounded on the law, but he's not authoritative to what is in the law. But again, Jacob offered a sacrifice, before it was unlawful for anyone but the Levites to do so. Let's go to that account. That's what it means, but sin is not imputed where there is no law. Book of Genesis, chapter 31, verse 54. Salakia, and it reads, "Then Jacob offered sacrifice upon the mount, and called his brethren to eat bread. And they did eat bread, and tarried all night in the mount." So, Paul is making, simple points here. And he's showing that these things are made plain as day. That's why, Paul said not to be beguiled in the simplicity that is in Hamashiach, according to 2 Corinthians 11 and 3. Let me just bring that precept real quick. The book of 2 Corinthians, chapter 11, verse 3. "But I fear lest by any means, as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Hamashiach." because Paul was teaching these Gentiles using easy comparisons to understand. Hence why he used the similitude of faith and Abraham having faith and showing it through his works. And in this similitude, the similitude of Adam through his transgression entering into the world, and like it says in Romans 5, 5 and 13, even unto the time that the law was instituted, there was already transgressions in the world, acceptable works and things unacceptable into the eyes of the Most High. And pursuant to Romans 4 and 12, Salakia, not Romans 4 and 12. 4 and 15, because the law worketh abhorrence, for where there no law is, there is no deviation. Paul's making this similitude in chapter 5, to show these Jews and Gentiles, that these works were already in the world, good and evil works, even up until before when the law was given. But there are some things, he's outlining that, transgression isn't imputed where there is no law, like I showed in Jacob offering sacrifice, Abraham having his stepsister to wife, so the point being, through Adam, these works were ordained from the beginning. So now he's asking them to look further back, because he asked them to look back in the previous chapter, before the law, as sort of references. So this is what you do. This is what Paul taught. Now he's telling them to go further back, so that they may see that, through Adam's transgression, these works remained on the earth, good and evil works, acceptable and unacceptable works. Through Cain, Moses, those pre-flood, post-flood, Jacob and Esau, all, as a pattern of things to come in the future. Using easy comparisons to understand. And, he advocated the usage and study of the things in the scriptures of the Old Testament. Which the things that they had at the time, the records that they had, the law, the prophets. This is why he continuously references these things and quotes from the prophets, the quotes of Adam, quotes of Abraham, talks about these things. Yahweh Shai taught in the same manner. He said to bring out things old and new. Book of Matthew, chapter 13, verse 52. And it reads, Then he said unto them, Therefore every scribe which is instructed into the kingdom of heaven is like unto a man that is an householder, which bringeth forth out of his treasure things new and old. So bringing out things new and old, to edify, reproof, rebuke, to exhort. This is what Paul was doing in his epistles. So now let's continue in Romans chapter 5. This book of Romans chapter 5 and verse 14. Nevertheless, death reigned from Adam to Moses, even over them that had not sinned after the similitude of Adam's transgression, who is the figure of him that was to come. So from Adam to Moses, these transgressions and these works continued upon the earth. they remained a righteous people, a righteous seed. You know, um, you know, Adam. Abraham. You know, Moses. He was or Salakia Noah. He was a righteous man. You know, Moses. Even his name. It means drawn out. Because he was drawn out. For from the people. Called out of Egypt. Same thing, same way Yahushua was called out of Egypt, same way the nation Israel was called out of Egypt. Because Moses, he was a lowly man. So all these things, as Paul teaches, he's telling these Jews and Gentiles, look back, and do not forget how these things already from the times of old, had already, have been designed, through the Most High. Verse 15, but not as the offense, so also is the free gift. For if through the offense of one many may be dead, much more the grace of God and the gift of grace, which is by one man, Yahushua HaMashiach, hath abounded unto many. The offense being the transgression that Adam had made. And Paul using that comparison of to the good and evil works, men entering into these generations of righteous and unrighteous men. So again, Paul is showing this separation, and many, many were given, to evil works, and, again, throughout Adam's transgression and throughout the generations, there were some that were given grace. For an example, Moses, he was given, a grace, to warn the people, and also to prepare, for the destruction that was coming. That was a similitude of grace. And also, the gift of grace being, Yahushua Mashiach, ultimately throughout the generations up until Moses, him being the one to prophesy of Yahushua coming into the scene, for him to be that grace for the time to come. Verse 16, and not as it was by one that sinned, so is the gift. For the judgment was by one to condemnation, but the free gift is of many offenses unto justification. So the free gift being the free gift being, the for example, the types of graces that the Most High had, which is, if you divide them, they're into 3 types of graces shown. The grace that was shown to those pre-law, which is a chosen seed, and after the law was instituted. Those that were given the law of sacrifice as a covering for sin. So this is why Paul talks about those from before the law up until the law of Moses. Because they were both these both generations, pre-law and post-law, were given grace, and Yahushua, ultimately, being that grace for these generations that came after the law. you know. So this is how he had abounded unto many, you know, which was the nation of Israel. Verse 16, you know, and from that time that the law was given, you know, there was many offenses, like it says in verse 16. You know, Israelites went off many, many times. You know, at a certain point, you know, you had northern and southern kingdom, you know, putting themselves into captivity, you know, by force. So this is verse 17. For if by one man's offense death reigned by one, much more they which received abundance of grace and of the gift of righteousness shall reign in life by one, Yahushua HaMashiach. So, you know, this is talking about the time after Yahushua's ministry and him being an atonement for sins. Verse 18, therefore, as by the offense of one, judgment came upon all men to condemnation, you know, through the works of Adam and his transgression. And, you know, it was meant to happen that way, you know. So, Yahushua can ultimately justify those men that had that same spirit of uprightness, you know, in the time to come, you know, so you can justify them, which are these Jews and these Gentiles. The free gift came upon all men unto justification of life. For as by one man's disobedience many were made sinners, so by the obedience of one shall many be made righteous. Verse 20. Moreover, the law entered that the offense might abound. But where sin abounded, grace did much more abound. So, you know, after the time that the law was given, you know, a grace that was given, a similitude of that grace was being able to offer sacrifice to cover for sins. So Yahushua being that ultimate, you know, example that, you know, Paul is essentially trying to get these Jews to see. Verse 21. That as sin hath reigned unto death, even so might grace reign thorough righteousness unto eternal life by Yahushua HaMashiach, our Lord. You know, so, you know, the first similitude of grace being, you know, sacrificial law, because that was a form of grace. And, you know, another form being, you know, being able to, you know, be justified in the atonement for sins that Yahushua, you know, died for the whole nation of Israel. So this is what Paul is speaking on. This is why he used that similitude. So that was Romans chapter 5. The Yatazadak, hero of Israel, giving all honor and glory to Yahweh Ba'ashim Yahushai. Say Shalom.